Every time she smiles at me, my heart forgets the rules, and I can't tell if I should run or stay. The first day I noticed her, it wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, no sudden lightning strikes in the sky. It was in the quiet, almost mundane way she entered the classroom, carrying a stack of papers with her usual poise. She moved with a grace that felt natural, effortless, and yet impossible to ignore. Her presence filled the room in a way that made the mundane fluorescent lights seem warmer, softer, as if the space had shifted slightly just because she was there. I was there to learn, to absorb knowledge, yet I found myself watching her more than the slides she projected on the screen. She smiled, just a small curve of her lips, but it lingered in a way that unsettled me. It wasn't the friendly, encouraging smile teachers give to all students. This one felt deliberate, directed at me, though I was probably imagining it. My chest tightened, a small, inexplicable thrill running through me. There was the faint scent of her perfume, subtle but distinctive, a mix of jasmine and something warmer, almost comforting. It lingered in the air around her, brushing past me when she moved to pass out assignments. Our hands brushed briefly as she handed me a paper, and though it was nothing, just a casual contact, it felt electric. I could still feel the warmth of her fingers, the light pressure against mine, and I caught myself staring at her a moment longer than I should have. I tried to focus on her words, her instructions, her lecture about theories and ideas that should have held my full attention, but my mind wandered. Her eyes, dark and attentive, seemed to flick toward me more than once, and each time our gaze met, I felt a quiet jolt of awareness, a mix of curiosity and nervous anticipation. She laughed lightly at a student's comment, the sound soft but resonant, and I realized I was holding my breath, not wanting to break the spell of that moment. I reminded myself, she's my teacher. Boundaries exist for a reason. And yet the thought of her presence, of her subtle glances and the way she smiled at me, stayed in my mind long after class ended. The hallway was bustling with students moving from one room to another, voices echoing off the walls, but I noticed her walk just a little slower than necessary, as if savoring the moment before stepping away. I wanted to follow her, to ask if she had meant the way she smiled, but propriety stopped me in my tracks. That small, fleeting interaction was enough to plant a seed, a quiet tension between us that neither of us had acknowledged yet. It was not a bold attraction, not something reckless or overt, but something simmering underneath, like the first hint of warmth in a cold morning. And as I left the classroom, I realized I was already anticipating the next time I would see her, the next time she would smile at me like that. The hallway felt unusually quiet that afternoon, the echo of footsteps bouncing softly off the lockers. I had lingered after class, ostensibly to organize my notes, but secretly, I was waiting, hoping for a moment to talk to her. And then she appeared, moving down the corridor with her usual calm confidence, the stack of papers in her hands balanced effortlessly as if they weighed nothing at all. She noticed me immediately, and for a brief moment, her eyes met mine. That look, it wasn't the quick, passing glance of a teacher glancing at a student. It held something else, curiosity, perhaps amusement, or maybe a subtle acknowledgement of our earlier interaction. My chest tightened, a mix of excitement and nervousness that made my fingers curl around my notebook a little too tightly. "You seem to have a question in class," she said, her voice gentle but precise, carrying that quiet authority that made it impossible not to listen. I felt my throat dry as I tried to formulate a coherent response, aware of the way she was standing slightly closer than necessary. There was a light warmth radiating from her presence, something about the way her shoulder brushed mine as she handed me a paper, a barely there touch that left an imprint on my skin. Her movements were natural, yet deliberate in a way that seemed to draw my attention to every detail. The way her hair fell over her shoulder when she leaned down to point something out, the faint sparkle in her eyes when she laughed at one of my clumsy attempts to answer. I couldn't help but notice how her perfume lingered even after she had stepped back, a subtle mix of jasmine and warm vanilla that seemed to wrap around me. For a moment, we were alone in that hallway, even though students passed by on either side, their voices and laughter fading into background noise. I felt a strange intimacy in the silence between us, a pause heavy with unspoken tension. Every subtle movement, her hand resting momentarily on my notebook, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes searched mine, felt charged, like a language I was only beginning to understand. I caught myself staring longer than I should, and I think she noticed. There was a brief, knowing smile, almost mischievous, as if she could sense my thoughts without me speaking a word. My pulse raced. I wanted to speak, to ask if she meant something in her glance, but propriety tethered my words, keeping them safe inside. When she finally moved on, walking toward the next classroom, I felt a strange emptiness, a quiet longing that settled in my chest. Yet, the memory of our brief closeness lingered, leaving me acutely aware of her presence even after she was gone. The hallway, once mundane and ordinary, now seemed infused with possibility, the subtle sparks of connection lingering like static in the air. It was more than admiration or respect, it was a beginning, a delicate first thread of something neither of us could name yet, but both of us felt. And as I gathered my courage to follow, to perhaps extend the conversation, I realized that this subtle dance of glances, touches, and unspoken words, was becoming the moment I found myself anticipating more than any lecture could ever teach me. The classroom was quiet long after the last students had left, the fluorescent lights casting a soft, even glow across the desks. I lingered by the door, pretending to sort my notes, though really, I was waiting. She had invited me to discuss my project further, a small gesture that felt weighty, charged with the tension neither of us dared name. When she entered, the air seemed to shift. Her presence filled the room, but in a way that felt intimate rather than imposing. She carried her usual calm confidence, yet there was a softness to her posture, a vulnerability she didn't show in front of the entire class. She set her papers down on the desk and gave me a brief, almost teasing smile, the kind that made my chest tighten and my pulse quicken without a single word being exchanged. As we sat across from each other, I noticed the details I had missed before, the faint crease near her eyes when she concentrated, the gentle sigh she gave when pointing out a small correction in my work, the subtle way she brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. Every movement seemed deliberate, intimate, drawing me in despite my best attempts to maintain focus. We talked about the project, but the conversation inevitably meandered. She asked questions that seemed designed not only to probe my understanding but also to see my thoughts, my perspective. I realized she was listening, truly listening, and in that attention, there was a closeness I had never experienced with a teacher before. At one point, our hands brushed over a paper as we both reached for it, and the contact lingered a fraction longer than necessary. I could feel the warmth of her fingers, subtle but unmistakable, and a shiver ran through me. She didn't pull away immediately, and I didn't either. We shared a glance, an unspoken acknowledgement of the quiet tension that hummed between us. The classroom felt smaller somehow, the walls and empty desks receding into the background. The scent of her perfume was stronger here, richer in the quiet of the room, mingling with the faint smell of chalk dust and old books. I found myself acutely aware of her nearness, the way her shoulder angled slightly toward mine, the soft rise and fall of her breath as she spoke. There was a pause in the conversation, a comfortable silence that carried its own weight. I wanted to say something, anything to break it, yet the words caught in my throat. Instead, I let the silence linger, feeling the quiet intimacy settle over us. In that space, I sensed her vulnerability, small, fleeting, but real, and it made me feel protective, drawn, and more connected to her than I had ever expected. When the discussion finally moved back to the project, it felt almost secondary. The real lesson of that evening wasn't about work, it was about presence, attention, and the unspoken bond forming between us. By the time I left the classroom, my mind replayed every glance, every brush of her hand, and every subtle smile. That private moment had planted something deep inside me, a quiet awareness that whatever this was, it was only just beginning. After that evening in the classroom, I couldn't seem to focus on anything else. The lecture notes, the assignments, even the simplest tasks felt muted, overlaid with the memory of her presence. It wasn't just the warmth of her hand brushing mine or the lingering scent of her perfume. It was the way she had looked at me, really looked, as though she could see past my careful exterior and into the parts of me I usually kept hidden. I found myself thinking about her at odd moments. Walking to the library, I imagined her smile waiting for me around the corner. Sitting at my desk, I remembered the softness in her voice as she explained a minor point in my project. Even the most ordinary things, a laugh shared with another student, a glance down a crowded hallway, suddenly carried an extra weight, a silent comparison to the moments I had shared with her. And yet, there was hesitation, a tug-of-war inside me. She was my teacher, older, wiser, and completely outside the bounds of anything I should pursue. Every logical thought screamed at me to maintain distance, to respect the boundaries set by the world and by common sense. But my heart argued differently, insistent and unrelenting, whispering that the quiet connection we shared was rare, fragile, and perhaps worth the risk. I began noticing little details I had previously overlooked, things that now seemed charged with meaning. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was focused. The subtle tilt of her head when she listened. The small crease in her brow when she considered my answers. Even the casual way she adjusted her scarf or shifted in her chair became a source of fascination. Every motion, every expression, seemed layered with unspoken possibility, and I was acutely aware of the effect it had on me. My pulse quickened, my stomach tightened, and I felt simultaneously grounded and unsteady. The tension wasn't just external, it was internal. I caught myself imagining scenarios that could never happen, wondering how it would feel to lean just a little closer during a discussion, or to hold her hand for longer than propriety would allow. I wrestled with guilt for indulging in these thoughts, yet they refused to leave. My feelings were no longer simple admiration or respect, they had become something more insistent, more complicated, and infinitely more compelling. Even when I tried to distract myself, her presence lingered. The library became a place I associated with her soft laughter. The hallways echoed with the warmth of her gaze. And each time our eyes met in class, I felt that familiar, electric pull, a magnetic tension that neither of us addressed openly, but that simmered in every glance, every brush of fingers, every small, deliberate smile. By the end of the week, I realized that my mind and heart were entwined in a quiet, relentless struggle. I wanted to resist, to maintain the distance reason demanded. But deep down, I knew that whatever this was, it had already begun to shape me. And the anticipation of the next encounter, the next smile, the next brush of her hand, was already impossible to ignore. It was a rainy evening when she suggested we meet in the library after hours. The soft patter of raindrops against the windows set a quiet rhythm, a backdrop that made the world outside seem distant, almost irrelevant. The fluorescent lights cast a gentle glow over the bookshelves, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper, polished wood, and faint traces of her perfume, subtle yet comforting, as if her presence alone had a way of warming the space. We sat across from each other at a small wooden table, each with our respective projects open, but conversation inevitably drifted away from the academic. I could sense her relaxing slightly, her usual composed confidence softened by the privacy of the empty library. She shared a story about her past, a small regret she had carried, tinged with a quiet sadness that made her seem even more human, more approachable. Her voice was calm, almost hesitant at first, as if she was testing the waters, but each word revealed a depth of vulnerability that she rarely let anyone see. I listened intently, aware of the subtle shifts in her posture, the way her fingers played with the edge of a notebook, the slight slump of her shoulders when speaking of disappointment, and the faint tremor in her hands when she paused. It was a side of her I hadn't imagined existed, and it drew me in, tugging at emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I responded honestly, sharing my own uncertainties, my fears, and the awkward vulnerabilities of being young and inexperienced in the world. The connection between us grew palpable in that quiet space. Our hands brushed occasionally while pointing to a passage or a note, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, and each subtle contact sent a ripple of awareness through me. When our eyes met, the depth of understanding and mutual respect in her gaze was almost overwhelming. It was as if she could see my hesitation, my longing, and my uncertainty, and yet she accepted it without judgment. At one point, we fell into a comfortable silence, neither needing to speak. The sound of the rain, the distant hum of the city outside, and the quiet breathing of the room became a shared rhythm. I noticed the way she tilted her head slightly toward me, her expression soft and attentive, waiting for a sign that I felt the same trust and connection she had just shown. It was an intimacy that transcended words, a closeness born of openness and mutual recognition of each other's vulnerabilities. Even as the conversation eventually shifted back to work, the atmosphere had changed. We were no longer simply teacher and student. We were two people quietly exploring the possibility of connection, of trust, of something unspoken yet undeniable. When I finally left the library that night, I carried with me a sense of warmth, a quiet anticipation for the next encounter, and the knowledge that this bond, delicate, unspoken, and emotionally rich, was already beginning to shape the way I saw her, and perhaps even the way she saw me. It was late afternoon, the kind of golden light that filtered through the classroom windows and softened everything it touched. I was gathering my notes after a discussion on my latest assignment when she appeared, leaning casually against the edge of a desk with that familiar, quiet confidence. The sunlight caught the subtle highlights in her hair, and the warmth of her presence seemed to radiate into the otherwise still room. She smiled at me, that smile, the one that had a history now, a weight I could feel in my chest. It wasn't merely encouraging, it was teasing, playful, and somehow daring. I tried to focus on my papers, to appear absorbed, but her eyes held mine, and I felt myself caught in a current I couldn't resist. My fingers fumbled with the edge of a notebook, my pulse quickening with each passing second. "Don't smile at me like that," she said lightly, a mischievous tilt to her lips. "Or I'll have to kiss you first." Her voice was soft, almost conversational, but the undercurrent of intent was unmistakable. The words hung in the air, charged with tension and possibility. I swallowed, caught between the desire to laugh nervously and the desire to respond in kind, my mind scrambling for an appropriate, rational reply that never came. Her proximity was intoxicating. She leaned just slightly closer, as if to emphasize her words, and I became acutely aware of the warmth of her presence, the subtle scent of her perfume, the way the sunlight brushed across her skin. Even a casual movement, her hand adjusting a pen, the slight shift of her weight, felt intimate, deliberate, and impossibly magnetic. Each detail sharpened my awareness, making it impossible to think of anything else. I wanted to speak, to respond with wit or humor, but instead, I found myself caught in the moment, my thoughts and words suspended. The playful challenge in her gaze contrasted with the quiet vulnerability I had glimpsed before, and it created a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. It was a test, but neither of us was truly testing the other. We were simply exploring the unspoken, the potential of something more, without crossing any overt boundaries. For a long beat, we just looked at each other, and the room seemed to shrink around us. The desks, the papers, the sunlight, they all faded into the background, leaving only the subtle hum of proximity and the quiet electricity between us. I could feel the warmth of her presence in my chest, the faint quickening of her pulse and the slight catch of her breath, and the knowledge that the line between playful teasing and genuine desire was thinner than ever. Finally, she leaned back, giving me a sly smile and a gentle nod, leaving the tension unresolved but simmering. I exhaled slowly, my mind spinning with anticipation, my body aware of every brush of air, every subtle movement she made as she left the room. The moment had passed, yet it lingered, a delicious ache that made me acutely aware of what I wanted and what I had to restrain. The game, I realized, was no longer subtle, it was real. And as I packed my belongings, I knew with certainty that our connection had crossed into a territory I couldn't ignore. The anticipation of the next encounter, the next look, the next word, had become irresistible, and the slow burn between us was reaching a point that neither of us could deny. The days following that playful, tension-filled afternoon passed in a strange sort of haze. Every glance, every subtle smile, every small interaction seemed amplified, charged with the unspoken understanding that lingered between us. I could feel her presence even when she wasn't there, an echo of warmth, a memory of her perfume, the quiet pull of her gaze. The anticipation was nearly unbearable, yet it was tempered by a growing sense of trust, of connection that was no longer just teasing or fleeting. Finally, one evening, she asked me to stay after class. The room was quiet, the golden light of sunset spilling through the windows, casting long, soft shadows across the desks. She sat across from me, her posture relaxed yet deliberate, and there was a softness in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a mixture of reassurance, care, and something deeper. The quiet hum of the building around us seemed to fade, leaving only the two of us in that small, intimate space. We talked, not about lectures or assignments, but about life, about hopes and regrets, about the strange ways we sometimes found ourselves connected to people we didn't expect. Her voice was calm and steady, but the vulnerability beneath it made my heart ache with empathy and longing. I responded with honesty, sharing the thoughts I had kept to myself, the small confessions that made me feel both exposed and oddly safe. At one point, our hands met across the table while reaching for the same notebook. This time, neither of us flinched. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the gentle steadiness of her fingers resting lightly against mine, and I realized it wasn't just contact, it was a bridge between us, a quiet acknowledgement of the feelings we had both been holding back. Her thumb brushed softly against the back of my hand, and I felt a wave of reassurance, of tenderness, that steadied the fluttering of my chest. Her smile followed, soft and unhurried, and for the first time, it felt like permission to acknowledge the connection, to embrace the closeness we had cultivated over days of glances, subtle touches, and shared vulnerabilities. She leaned slightly forward, her forehead resting lightly against mine, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The warmth of her presence, the quiet intimacy, the unspoken acknowledgement of desire and care, it was overwhelming and grounding all at once. We didn't need words for what happened next. A gentle cheek kiss, a lingering hand hold, a quiet embrace, these small, deliberate gestures carried everything we couldn't say. The slow burn that had simmered between us found its release in these tender, emotionally charged touches. The boundaries of age, circumstance, and propriety were acknowledged but softened by trust and mutual respect. As I finally left the classroom that evening, I felt a sense of completeness, a warmth that settled deep in my chest. The tension, the anticipation, and the longing had transformed into something steady, reassuring, and real. Our connection wasn't reckless or impulsive, it was deliberate, meaningful, and entirely ours. And though the world outside would continue as it always had, within that quiet classroom, we had found something lasting, a bond built on trust, tenderness, and the kind of slow, careful love that neither of us would ever forget.